India is not a nation nor a country. It's a subcontinent of different nationalities. In the past few decades, India has garnered a lot of attention as a potential great power, if not superpower, as it's the world's largest economy, soon to be largest population, as well as a global leader in politics, in economics, and technology, and really a powerhouse among the developing nations. The reason why India is considered to be a subcontinent is in part because it has its own tectonic plate, separate from the Eurasian plate. The colliding of these two plates created the Himalayan mountains, a giant barrier creating a fortress on the Indian subcontinent, and it's also home to the highest mountains on the planet. To the west of India lies Pakistan, its arch rival, which is also in the Indian subcontinent. They contain the Suleiman Mountains, which merge into the Hindu Kush. I would like to clarify that the Hindu Kush is a mountain chain and not a strain of weed in this video. Apparently it translates into Hindu killers in Persian. Don't blame me in the comments, I am not the person who picked the name of this mountain range. Anyway, moving on, the Hindu Kush transitions into the Arakan range, which despite its lack of as many snow-capped mountains and lower elevations, acts as a barrier between the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Many of these natural features that straddle the Indian subcontinent aren't just mountains. Many of them are deserts, swamps, various types of wetlands, the ocean, and jungle. This creates somewhat of a fortress on the Indian subcontinent, separating it and insulating it from the rest of the Eurasian landmass. This may explain why certain external forces like Alexander the Great or the Muslims were not able to make it too far into the Indian subcontinent, and others like the Chinese didn't even bother. This may explain why most of the conquest throughout Indian history has been done within the Indian subcontinent. The mountains also explain its most well-known social feature, its massive population. The glacier-tipped mountain ranges end up melting into rivers, carrying rich silt deposits with tons of nutrients that provide great farming land on the lower lands of the Indian subcontinent. The rich nutrients carried by these glacial waters created a massive surplus of crops for early farmers, not only in the Indian subcontinent, but also on the other side of the Himalayan mountains in China. This is why both countries have such large populations. And as a result of this, they have some of the most important rivers. In Pakistan lies the Indus River Valley, where India arguably gets its name from. This was the home of the Indus River Valley civilization, the first main Indian subcontinent civilization. This early civilization on the Indian subcontinent is relatively little known about compared to those of the Middle East and China. However, they were fairly sophisticated, including good sewer systems, better than what you'd see in a Calcutta slum today. The other major river is the Ganges, which starts off in the Himalayas and then ends up in the Bay of Bengal. It's also very sacred to various religious people, and is also incredibly important for infrastructure as it provides transportation and movement of goods and services. The river also has a lot of tributaries, which allows for the easy movement of goods and services, as well as various political powers being able to control specific portions of tributaries rather than the river as the whole. Another factor about this river is that despite its incredible wildlife and usefulness, large swaths of it are, well, full of shit. Literally. And there have been many attempts by both ancient and modern governments to address this issue. Much of the nutritional soil ends up in the Bay of Bengal, and this rich nutrients allows Bangladesh to have a population larger than Russia in an area the size of Texas. Bangladesh and the surrounding regions of India lie in a floodplain, and unlike a country like the Netherlands, which also relies on floodplains, it does not have a complex system of dikes and levees, making it very vulnerable to flooding. This will be likely to lead to a refugee crisis as climate change raises sea levels, and India will probably bear the biggest brunt of the refugee crisis. Nonetheless, due to its conduciveness for human life, the northern plains are the most important population centers on the Indian subcontinent. This includes the well-known region of Punjab, located in both India and Pakistan. It also holds a very large Sikh population, mostly on the Indian side. Much of this highly populated area is surrounded by deserts and swamps, meaning that there's a great concentration of population density as opposed to the surrounding areas. To the south, there are lesser-known mountain ranges, such as the East and West Ghats, with the Deccan Plateau between them. However, these are nowhere near as high. The populations in the southern portions of India are not as big because there is less water and less fertile soil. This area gets less rain from the monsoon. However, rains do hit the eastern plains more heavily, resulting in a higher population there. Nonetheless, the coastal areas are far more highly populated, in part due to trade routes and a lot more rain, most notably Mumbai. The more lush monsoon-hit areas produce a lot of rice, whereas a lot of the drier, more arid regions produce a lot more of millet and wheat. The southern coasts also have a lot of harbors, which can be used for seaports, and can extend India's trade as they've done in the past and currently do so in the present throughout the Indian Ocean and abroad, spreading Indian culture to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and certain parts of Africa. It's also worth noting that the further south you go on the Indian subcontinent, you see less Indo-European peoples and more native Dravidian peoples with darker skin. These ethnic tensions sometimes do arise, particularly given the caste system. The system of tributaries along the northern plains has led to a bunch of diversification, as various political principalities, as well as a great deal of cultures, can flourish that are connected with each other but at the same time somewhat distinct. This makes the entire concept of India itself a relatively fickle modern one. These various ethnic, caste-based, religious identities, tribal identities, etc., or even geographic identities, far predate the modern state of India, and it has been rather hard to consolidate all of them under one nation. However, the flatlands and tributaries did make it relatively easy for certain groups of people to conquer other groups of people across the plains. This led to some empires during Indian history and other periods of fragmentation. However, the natural barriers around the subcontinent pretty much stopped any sort of mass expansion into the subcontinent by outsiders. Alexander the Great barely made it into the Indian subcontinent. The Muslims pushed further, but were never able to fully subjugate the subcontinent itself, and the Mongols, for the most part, didn't even bother. This means that throughout most of India's history, there wasn't really an India to begin with. It was various competing factions warring against each other or trading with each other, and their various client states that they could play off each other. The last native rulers were the Mughals, who had some Mongolian ancestry, although the extent is debatable. The Mughals weren't really reigning over all of India at the time. As we all know, India did not really exist, but rather played off various factions against each other around the subcontinent. And this strategy was quite effective for dealing with external threats coming from terrestrial borders. However, it was not particularly effective when dealing with maritime borders, namely the British Empire. The British mastered the Mughal strategy of playing various factions against each other, stationing a relatively small group of British diplomats and military officers in the region, and then using clients in India to basically control the region, with relatively little force, but quite a lot of subjugation. The British even were partially responsible for a famine in Bengal, and by the end of the colonization project, India went from being one of the richest countries to one of the poorest during the mid-20th century. However, they weren't 100% evil. The British did set up the foundations for India's democracy, built railroads, and banned some practices that were particularly unfair to women. Through the leadership of Gandhi and Nehru, India eventually got its independence from Britain peacefully. The British decided to break up the Indian subcontinent by religion rather than by other means, creating a Hindu Republic of India, which was pluralistic and fairly secular, with the Muslim Pakistan/Bangladesh, which at the time was part of Pakistan. Some, like Gandhi, wanted a more pluralistic system, but he was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. While the British leaving was peaceful, the partition between India and Pakistan was a disaster, leading to mass displacement, riots, and violence. Thankfully, the partition has led to peaceful relations between Muslims and Hindus, and India and Pakistan are super best friends that never hate each other. No, that's actually a bunch of bullshit. Nehru became the first prime minister of the new republic. He transitioned India into a fairly liberal democracy and a secular nation with Hindu elements. He was also a leader of the Non-Aligned Movement, a group of nations that were developing countries that threw off the yoke of European imperialism and did not want to take a stand during the Cold War. While neutral, India did generally prefer the Soviet Union over the United States during the Cold War. It was also at loggerheads with Pakistan, which generally speaking was more friendly with the United States. But nonetheless, the Cold War was really the backdrop between the conflict between these two nations that was at the forefront of the Indian subcontinent, particularly over the issue of Kashmir. The Pakistanis were particularly suppressive towards the Bengalis, who were also Muslim. This led to India basically helping Bangladesh win its independence war against Pakistan. The Bengalis, despite being Muslim, were more willing to ally with their neighbor India as opposed to their imperial overlord Pakistan, despite Pakistanis and Bengalis both being Muslim. Matters became worse as both countries developed nuclear weapons in order to thwart an attack from each other. In spite of the geopolitical tensions during the Cold War, India did grow its economy pretty impressively after the Soviet Union collapsed. The end of the Cold War, along with the September 11th attacks, made India much closer to the United States, as both countries were the victims of Islamic terrorism, India for a much longer period of time. And along with that, both countries are major leaders in the tech sphere. One masterful version of statecraft that India has enacted has been the emphasis on information technology. Bangalore is basically India's San Francisco, and Pune is its Boston. One is a technological innovation center, the other one is an educational center. As of the recording of this video, the current leader of India is Modi, who comes from the region of Gujarat, known for its great businessmen, and as a result, his policies are pro-business. Gujarat is basically India's commercial center, and has excellent laws for entrepreneurship. Modi is also a Hindu nationalist, and some have accused him of Islamophobia. His party has passed an amendment to the Citizenship Act of 1955. The country extends some citizenship protections from people fleeing Muslim-majority countries who are Hindu, Sikh, Jains, Christians, or other groups of people. However, it excludes Muslims. Many accuse this of being Islamophobic and purposely trying to exclude Muslims, while others claim that many of these people fleeing these countries are coming from, well, Muslim-majority countries and fleeing the theocracy in those nations. Some territories of India have even created a registry that involves religious identity, which some view as a gate opening for religious discrimination. Many Hindu nationalists view these policies as a way of keeping India's borders intact, and they particularly view India's Muslim population with suspicion and oftentimes see them as Pakistani sympathizers. After all, India's protections on Muslims is far greater than Pakistan's protection of Hindus. While India and Pakistan's relationship has always been shitty for the most part, its diaspora has gotten along fairly well. Nonetheless, there is still the contested issue of Kashmir to the north, a contested alpine region in which both countries claim ownership of. The land is split fairly equally among the two of them. However, India controls most of the population, and abuses, violence, and subjugation at the hands of both forces are quite common. Pakistan views Kashmir as its jugular vein, connecting the country to China, its ally and adversary of India. Meanwhile, India is very concerned about the Pakistani-Chinese alliance, not just in Kashmir, but also the Chinese building ports and infrastructure along Pakistan's coast through its Belt and Road Initiative. Relations between India and China have been frosty as the Himalayan mountains that separate the two nations. Because of this mountain range, the warfare between these two countries has been very limited. Nonetheless, the tensions reside as a result. Tensions came to a boil when China invaded and took over Tibet in the 1950s. This led to the exile of the Dalai Lama in India, which results in tensions to this day. Because of the massive alpine peaks providing a barrier, it's unlikely that these two countries would come into conflict with each other militarily. However, there will almost certainly be more scuffles in the future. On top of that, China has been quite adamant about building dams across the Himalayas, which will provide China with power, but will choke off much of India's water supply. India has also taken issue with Chinese investments in the Bay of Bengal and Sri Lanka. To compensate for this, India has joined the Quad group, composed of India itself, obviously, along with the United States, Japan, and Australia, other nations that seek to basically assuage China's rise, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. Some, like the late US Senator and former presidential candidate John McCain, have advocated that India may need a permanent seat on the UN Security Council to thwart China. India, in sharp contrast to China, is not a major exporter of goods. However, it does excel in services, particularly services related to information technology. While not full-blown allies, the US and India will partner when it comes to excelling in technology and excluding China from information technology and intellectual property. Despite being very friendly with Western nations and Israel, India also maintains close ties with Russia and Iran. India has a very large diaspora population in the West and many cultural ties. However, at the same time, it's also a major arms buyer of Russian weapons. At the end of the day, India is balancing friendly relations with the outside world to make up for hostile relations within its subcontinent. So how does all of this affect India's propensity to become a world power? Well, thank you for asking, hypothetical person. Well, on one hand, India is a very diverse cosmopolitan nation, which has a great deal of advantages, but at the same time, its diversity can also cause confusion, particularly when it comes to its excess bureaucracy and differences between regional bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in India is a nightmare. It is so mired in red tape that it makes certain policies very difficult to implement. And on top of that, corruption just compounds the issue, stifling economic growth. Overly complicated tax codes, excessive regulations that vary upon region, create a situation that is very difficult to do business in many parts of India. This makes monetary and fiscal policy on a national level, let alone a regional and local level, very difficult. But nonetheless, India has seen some remarkable economic growth. India's economic output abroad has mostly focused on the service sector rather than manufacturing and goods, unlike China. India's economy is fairly self-contained, which is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because India is fairly self-sufficient, but also a curse because it lacks the same sort of external markets and opportunities that other nations do. On one hand, India is an excellent location of investment. After all, it has a rising middle class, a fair amount of good technology, and large English-speaking population. It's an open, pluralistic democracy, but at the same time, it's corrupt and mired in so much red tape that makes it very difficult for external investment, which leads many to flee. India's economic growth will almost certainly continue to rise, most likely surpassing most European nations and Japan in terms of the size of its economy. However, it will probably not surpass the US or China. On top of that, it will still lag behind in terms of standard of living. Growth isn't everything at the end of the day. India will almost undoubtedly become a more important figure in the future due to its large population, large educated English-speaking base, large set of natural resources, and diversified economy that is on one hand self-contained, but on the other hand fairly interconnected with the global economy, having the best of both worlds. If India is to improve its status, it needs to 1. Decrease the complex or overly complex Byzantine structures of its administration and legal systems. It needs to amend ethnic and religious tensions within its own countries, soften some of the antagonistic relationships with its neighbors, and perhaps make it more business friendly if it truly wants to be a new Asian tiger. Thank you for watching, everybody. Please subscribe if you enjoy.